The press now. I'm Garrett Hake in Washington, where President Trump is full steam ahead with his sweeping second-term agenda as he defends pardoning violent January 6th rioters, deploys troops to the southern border, and takes new steps to reshape the federal workforce in his image. It comes as we're learning new details about the president's last-minute decision to pardon virtually every person charged in connection with the January 6th attack on the Capitol. A decision that was made just days before the inauguration, according to two officials who worked on Trump's transition, surprising even some of his own aides. The move came after Trump himself publicly indicated he wasn't going to pardon violent rioters, telling Meet the Press last month that he would issue pardons on a case-by-case basis. The White House yesterday, my colleague Peter Alexander pressed the president on his decision.
You would agree that it's never acceptable to assault a police officer,
Sure.
right? So then if I can, among those you pardoned, DJ Rodriguez, he drove a stun gun into the neck of a D.C. police officer who was abducted by the mob that day. He later confessed on video to the FBI and pleaded guilty for his crimes. Why does he deserve a pardon?
Well, I don't know. Was it a pardon? Because we're looking at commutes and we're looking at pardons. Okay, well, we'll take a look at everything. These people have already served a long period of time, and I made a decision to give a pardon. Joe Biden gave a pardon yesterday to a lot of criminals. These are criminals that he gave a pardon to.
And you're a president who has long said that you back the blue, but aren't you sending the message that assaulting officers is okay with these pardons?
No, the opposite.
Today on Capitol Hill, House Speaker Mike Johnson defended President Trump's pardon authority while also criticizing former President Biden's pardons for members of his family during his final minutes in office.
The president has the pardon and commutation authority. It's his decision, and I think what was made clear all along is that peaceful protests and people who engage in that should never be punished. There was a weaponization of the Justice Department. The president's made his decision. I don't second guess those, and yes, you know, it's kind of my ethos, my worldview. We believe in redemption. It was shocking. I mean, it was shocking what President Biden did on the way out. Pardoning his family for more than a decade of whatever activity, any nonviolent offenses. It was breathtaking to us. To us, it is disgusting. To us, it probably proves the point, the suspicion that, you know, they call it the Biden crime family. If they weren't the crime family, why do they need pardons, right?
Today, President Trump is also plowing ahead on another key campaign promise, his immigration agenda. The White House press secretary saying moments ago that the administration is planning to send approximately 1,500 additional active duty troops to the U.S. southern border. To do what is still unclear. President Trump is also making notable changes to the federal workforce. In a memo from the Office of Personnel Management, the administration is ordering all departments and agencies to place employees in DEI roles on paid leave no later than 5 o'clock today, and to come up with a plan to potentially fire those employees. Additionally, the president has fired 4 top officials who oversee U.S. immigration courts. He's fired the head of the Coast Guard, and he's asked several career Foreign Service diplomats to step back from senior positions. And he's removed or reassigned career DOJ officials in the National Security Division. The president also made other government workforce moves on day one, including implementing a hiring freeze, mandating return to office, and making it easier to fire federal employees. All of these moves by the president facing little in the way of actual pushback from Congress as the new administration looks to move quickly to implement its agenda. Joining me now is NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell, and NBC News Justice reporter Ryan Reilly is with me here on set. Kelly, what else stood out to you from those lengthy remarks from the president yesterday defending these pardons?
Part of what is striking is that the president has apparently linked so many of his actions with respect to pardons to not the things we are traditionally looking for in pardons. And that often has been rehabilitation of the person who was convicted, contrition on their part. Was there a specific action by the judicial process that needs to be addressed? Instead of those kinds of things, he's talked about broad weaponization, did not seem familiar with the specifics of the cases. And because there are 1,500 of them, that might be a reasonable thing. He talked about we could look at it, even though the power to offer commutation and pardon is absolute. So there's no going back and undoing a specific case if he were to somehow review that. And a lot of what he has talked about is how these cases, whether it's the January 6th pardons that he has granted and the commutations there, or that of the dark net drug kingpin, Russell Ulbricht, that these are people who have some connection to supporting him, and he has talked about that. With the darknet, Silver Road kingpin, if you can use that term, cocaine, heroin trafficking, and so forth. It's about his libertarian cause and the support among people in that community and the crypto community that he has a tie to as well. With the January 6th, that has been a politically intensified part of the culture. And even as members of Congress talk about not wanting to see violent offenders, they talk about due process. Well, the cases did go through due process, and obviously peaceful protesters might have had a trespass conviction, but that's not the bulk of what people are talking about here. They're talking about violent acts, damage to the Capitol, and trying to obstruct official acts. So the president's view of what a pardon is for is somewhat different than we've seen over time.
I think that's definitely becoming clear. And Ryan, you've covered so many of these cases for so long. What's the reaction been from all sides to this decision by the president?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've seen some Democrats put out statements. Sometimes it's taken them like 24 hours to put out a statement on this. But, you know, you've seen some defense from Mike Johnson, I think, for Speaker Mike Johnson, comparing that to the Biden, sort of the, what about ism with the Biden pardons. And, someone will have to fact check me on this, but I don't know if any members of the Biden family drove a stun gun into a cop's neck at the Capitol, right? So I think that that's sort of what you have to look at here is what are the facts of these cases? What has been proven in court? Because we see a lot of political rhetoric coming from Capitol Hill, but the facts of these cases are extraordinarily clear and beyond any reasonable doubt. And that's why judges of both parties convicted these individuals, because the evidence was just so completely overwhelming of their guilt. You can sort of do the NFL thing and switch around and look at these. This is a crime that was captured on camera from every different angle. And you can look at that and see what the evidence is.
And it's not just the people who were at the Capitol, but we're also seeing pardons for some of these figures who were behind-the-scenes players like Enrique Tarrio. We have new video of him returning to Miami. What happens to him now? What happens to these militias, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, that have been kind of dormant and now have their leadership back if they want them, I suppose? Yeah,
it's a great question. I mean, he's been on a little bit of a sabbatical there, right? Is he coming back now? Is he going to be taking charge of this organization? And the real question is, with someone like Kash Patel coming into the FBI, are they going to be very worried about, the FBI really looking into them? Because imagine working at the FBI and there was just this message sent that all of this political violence at the Capitol was okay. We're not caring about that. We're not going to arrest these 200 people who we have. Because I think that's one thing that people don't recognize necessarily. There's the 400 people who are pardoned who are already guilty of attacking officers or very serious felonies. Those are sort of the 400 I think most people are focused on. But then there's 200 other people who the online sleuths have already identified to the FBI. They have those names in their possession right now. They could charge them. There's still a year left in the statute of limitations. But now you're saying what the FBI is going to have to sit on their hands, and prosecutors are going to have to sit on their hands and not vindicate those victims who were assaulted by that day.
Those people straight up get away with it.
Yeah.
This is maybe a technical question, but the nature of these pardons are for the actions on January 6th. There are cases, for example, where you have a January 6th rioter who was convicted of trying to kill FBI agents later. Someone like that's not pardoned for those additional crimes, right?
There's an extremely narrow category. 1,500 pardons, that's huge. And a lot of these people have committed other crimes that this doesn't really apply to, but that's the narrow set of categories of people who are still being held today. There's one individual who threw an explosive device into the tunnel where so many officers were victimized that day, who then was charged with a gun charge afterwards because, they searched his house, right? So there are these sort of add-on charges that might be at play, but that's such a tiny category. You're talking about maybe, a dozen or so people, including that individual who plotted to murder the FBI and was convicted by, I will say, not a D.C. jury, judge all the way, or a jury all the way over in Tennessee that looked at that evidence, swore an oath, looked at the evidence, and said this man is guilty of plotting to kill FBI special agent who investigated him for January 6th.
Ryan, thank you for all of your reporting on this. We've clearly not talked about this for the last time. I think it's going to continue to be a story. Ryan Reilly on the Justice Beat. Kelly, I want to come back to you for just a second because there are so many other layers to all of this. The Trump administration also has ordered all federal employees in DEI roles, something that I don't think they clearly define necessarily, be placed on leave. Do we have any sense yet of who all could be swept up by this, how many people we're talking about, and where this fits in Trump's sort of culture war agenda?
Well, on the culture war piece, he is arguing that he wants to restore merit-based opportunities for hiring in the federal workforce, and he believes that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs somehow are not along the lines of merit and have been unfair. And so he wants to root those out. You're right about the question of how many people. In some cases, there are specific programs in federal agencies that have been formally attached to that concept of trying to make certain that there is opportunity in the workforce and trying to have programs tailored to those who've been underrepresented. Those kinds of programs may be easier to spot. So any unit that is directly attached to that kind of work is included in this. But they're also looking for ways that those kinds of themes might have been employed in other parts of the workforce. And so they're kind of casting a net to try to figure out where that is. They also want to know if there were any efforts to shield some of those programs with a different name or in some other way in order to keep them going. So they're really trying to root out the obvious and then the less obvious along these lines, believing that they want only merit-based. Now, these employees who are affected by this will be paid, but their work is cut off, no email, no access to the office and so forth for some period of time. And then ultimately, because of protections for the civilian workforce, they may have other opportunities for employment in the federal government. Some may just choose to walk away. And that's part of what we're seeing as well. This trying to put pressure on federal workers who don't have the same ideas as the Trump administration. Some will find new homes. Others will simply be out.
And Kelly, it's pretty clear that the president is forging ahead with this agenda with basically no guardrails, in part because he doesn't have to face the voters again, but his Republican allies will, especially in the House, and especially some of the folks who met with him today, these House members who were Republicans who represent Kamala Harris districts. Do we have any idea what came out of that meeting and what these groups, those members, and Donald Trump want from each other?
Well, that is the distinction that is so clear and so telling about Donald Trump, who now knows more about the office, does not want to be constrained by the typical rules, and won't have to face voters again. So he's plowing ahead. Taking with him are these other elected representatives who do have to face the voters and have to answer for these things. And the new practice in Washington is, at least in these early days, asking all of these members, do they agree or not agree, and how do they respond to the actions of the president when he's forging ahead. So this puts pressure on them. And at the same time, they have to try to find a way to not get sideways with the president. Clearly, that's treacherous terrain, but to also talk about how things might be different in individual cases and how it's reflected in their own home districts. And so that will be an ongoing challenge. There's some careful walking on those kinds of issues, Garrett.
Definitely. And with a majority this small, every single one of those members is a majority maker and has a little more pull than they might have otherwise. Kelly O'Donnell, thank you for that reporting. And as we mentioned, the Trump administration is planning to send about 1,500 additional active duty troops to the southern border, according to a senior White House official, although the exact details of their deployment remain unknown. That comes as Trump's Justice Department is also making immigration enforcement one of the department's top priorities. A new memo from the acting attorney general instructs federal prosecutors to investigate any state or local official who resists or obstructs the enforcement of federal immigration laws. NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley joins me now. Julia, you're going to be busy, and I know you already are.
So, yeah.
Hopefully you can answer this question. Do we know what these additional troops will be doing at the border or what they can't do?
We know what they can't do, at least what the Constitution says they can't do.
That
and
old
we'll
thing.
see if, yeah, right, exactly, if Trump tries to push that at all. But they should be there to, they've done in the past, and they did under the first Trump administration. They can build barriers. They can help put wire over the border wall. They can transport migrants from one place to another, which is actually a really important job if you're trying to increase deportations.
Sure.
And then they can also just help in any kind of, anything that doesn't include arresting migrants, because that would be violating posse comitatus. It's something in the Constitution that precludes the military from enforcing domestic law within U.S. boundaries. And so that is their limit, but they could go pretty far. The other way the military could be instrumental at the border is if they can give some land. If Trump is going to try to detain every migrant who crosses, as he's said in recent executive orders today that he will, and he's going to try to drastically increase deportations, he has to have some place to hold these people. If they can use military land and use military personnel there, that could be helpful for him.
Talk to me about this DOJ memo memo. Is this a dramatic change in policy and posture, or is this the Trump administration just trying to put voice to an idea of the Trump campaign?
It's dramatic, but it's not surprising, I would say. We were reporting on this shortly after the election because we knew this was a big plan of the transition. They want to restrict federal funding for many sanctuary cities, and then they want to be able to actually prosecute any state and local police or officials that they think get in their way. It really mischaracterizes what a sanctuary city is, though. All that means is that if a cop encounters an undocumented person, they don't call up ICE to come pick them up and deport them. It never has meant that they're standing in front of doorways or keeping ICE from making arrests. So
what kind of charges would we be looking at here? Are you an accessory to an undocumented person's entry? I mean, I can't get there.
Yeah, I mean, look, they could do it in a number of ways. They could also look at any kind of local official that's giving out aid, you know, as some cities have done, so that they don't have migrants sleeping on their streets. They could see that as something that counters the mission of ICE. We're at this phase, and I can remember it in 2017 in January, where Trump is putting out these really vague executive orders. The latest one he just sent out was suspend physical entry of all aliens, meaning immigrants crossing the border. What does that mean in practice, though? Border Patrol hasn't gotten a memo that says what they're supposed to do with that. So we're getting a lot of these broad parameters, the structure, but the meat on the bones hasn't quite become clear yet.
Yeah, can we go a little deeper on that? Because to me, isn't that the job of the Border Patrol anyway? I mean, is this just Trump, again, trying to sort of get credit for telling these agencies to go do their jobs?
Right. They already arrest people who cross illegally if they spot them and can arrest them. And we just heard from Caroline Leavitt, who was on Fox a few minutes ago, who really didn't add a whole lot more detail to this anyway. She just said, this is Trump making good on his promise. No one should be thinking about coming to the border. But there's some language in there, Garrett, that could be interpreted and taken really far. It says, the Department of Homeland Security, Justice, and State can do anything in their power to repel migrants. I mean, are we talking about family separation again? There are a lot of questions about what this can lead to, and does it allow for kind of some rogue actors to take matters into their own hands, or are they going to give really specific advice? And yes, currently, asylum at the southern border is already almost impossible to come by if you cross illegally.
We're going to find out more, and hopefully soon, from your great reporting, Julia Ainsley. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.